Hello, listeners, and welcome back to Dragon's Greed Gaming. It is I, your host, the Great Unclean One. Wanted to welcome you to the show and just take a moment here to remind you be sure you stop by our Facebook page and follow us there for all the latest news on the channel and our ever growing amount of shows. If you can, we appreciate if you can stop by iTunes and Apple Podcast, give us a 5-star review, help us grow the channel, and help us get out in front of more people as we continue to expand. Also, be sure you stop by our YouTube channel. We've finally got some real video content we're starting to produce, and be sure you subscribe and hit that little bell to get all notifications when we have new episodes coming out. We're still putting out all of our actual play series, but we've got real video series coming out as well, with more planned for the future. And finally, if you're a big fan of the show, if you want to help support us a little bit more, consider joining our Patreon, Dragon's Greed Gaming. We have a couple different tiers you can check out. Get yourself access to early access to our weekly episodes, monthly artwork from Kyle, get your name up on our Wall of Heroes wall, or check out our Patreon-only exclusive actual play series that we do once a month, a Warhammer Fantasy actual play series called Tales from the Old World. Something there for everybody, and for a couple bucks, toss a couple coins in the Dragon's Hoard and help us out. But however you choose to support us, we appreciate, even if you're just listening, first-time listeners, new listeners, or old veterans, old raving fans. We appreciate each and every one of you guys and hope you enjoy tonight's show. Thanks so much. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to Dragon's Greed Gaming. It's me, your host, the Great Unclean One, and I thank you for joining me today. I'm running solo here today as we are going to be taking a short look at the Blade Runner role-playing game by Free League Publishing. We're going to start with a small introduction to the Blade Runner universe, and then a breakdown of the rules, theme, and flow of the game. So sit back, relax, and let's get lost in this neon-lit noir like tears in rain. First off, if you're new here, welcome. This is Dragon's Greed Gaming, a channel about all things gaming. We've been running the show now for about 2.5 years, primarily focusing on a podcast featuring actual play series of various role-playing games. We've played through 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, a bunch of the Alien RPG, and we just recently finished a Warhammer 40,000 Wrath and Glory campaign. You can also check us out on YouTube, where we have finally started to release some real video content with our first series, A Tale of Four Gamers, where me and some of our regulars take a trip down memory lane, document our hobby journey as we begin new 1,000-point armies for 6th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles. As we continue to grow the channel, we hope to bring a nice variation of games for you to enjoy with us, both in podcast and video format. So who am I? Well, I'm glad you asked. If you are not familiar with me, I am the Great Unclean One, the host and GM here on the show. I've been playing games for about as long as I can remember, starting with plenty of video games back when I was a wee lad, and eventually getting sucked into the world of tabletop games. I started playing Warhammer back around in 5th grade, and I got into RPGs in high school, and I have never looked back. I also worked for Games Workshop for about 8 years in the 2000s, and I have pretty much become the forever GM of my various gaming groups. I even helped design and produce a few games with some friends a couple years ago that we actually brought to market, which is very exciting. Suffice to say, I'm a gamer through and through, and this show is my latest endeavor in my gaming hobby and repertoire. Anyway, that's enough about me. Let's talk some Blade Runner. So, what exactly is Blade Runner? Well, starting with the original film in 1982, starring Harrison Ford and directed by Ridley Scott. Yes, the same Ridley Scott of Alien fame. Blade Runner is a dystopian, futuristic, neo-noir movie. It's an adaptation of Philip K. Dick's 1968 novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? The plot focuses around synthetically created humans known as replicants who are bioengineered by the Tyrell Corporation to perform work on the off-world colonies and in all manner of dangerous and hazardous jobs. A group of rogue replicants returns to Earth, and Ford's character, Rick Deckard, a Blade Runner, is called in to hunt them down and retire them, this world's term for executing a replicant. Blade Runners are a special type of police officer that is trained to detect, hunt down, and eliminate rogue replicants. The film asks questions like what it means to be human. Is there really even a difference between human and replicants? Does it even matter? It explores the idea that not everything is black and white, and that there's a vast gray between those two extremes. It challenges our perceptions of humanity and morality, and takes a closer look at feelings like empathy and forgiveness, all while questioning our reality and our dreams. It's also considered one of the original foundations of the cyberpunk genre, with its neon-bathed, rain-drenched streets of 2019 Los Angeles, flying cars, and a unique blend of urban decay and technology. It didn't fare too well when it was originally released, but since then has become a cult classic and is often considered one of the greatest sci-fi films ever made. Now, 35 years later, we finally got a sequel in 2017 titled Blade Runner 2049, starring Ryan Gosling and directed by Denis Villeneuve. In this, Gosling plays K, a replicant Blade Runner who is designed to hunt down his own kind. Ford reprises his role as Deckard, and the film expands the lore of the universe by taking a look at a much larger portion of 2049 LA with absolutely stunning practical effects. Like most sequels, especially to a cult classic like the original film, it has a divisive fan base, but in my humble opinion, it is not only a worthy follow-up, but in some cases I think it even surpasses the original. Yes, I said it. I actually prefer 2049 over the original. Not that the original's bad, but I think 2049's a little bit better. There's plenty of other Blade Runner media out there as well. Video games, comics, and a really cool animated series titled Blade Runner Black Lotus. Animated, I'm not sure. Anyway, it's got a similar look to Star Wars The Clone Wars. So whatever type of animation that is, if you enjoyed that, you'll probably get a kick out of Black Lotus. It also is in the continuity, and it explains, among other things, how Neander Wallace loses his eyesight. So if you want to figure out how that happens in 2049, watch Black Lotus first. There's also a series of 3 short films that was created by Villeneuve, the director of 2049. They were released in the lead up to 2049 being released. They act as prequels that explain some of the important events that happened between the 2 films. Highly recommend all 3. But Blackout and I think it's Nexus Dawn, those 2 really help add some context to some of the more important things that happen and fill in some of the gaps in the storyline. So, but they're all awesome, all recommended. So, if you're a fan of sci-fi, cyberpunk, or detective noir style storytelling, Blade Runner might be just up your alley. I don't think you absolutely need to see the films to enjoy the RPG, but it definitely feels like this is more of a niche game, and you'll enjoy it all the more if you understand a little bit about the universe before diving in. So, now that we've gone over a brief introduction to the universe of Blade Runner, let's talk about the role-playing game. Released about a year ago, within the last year, by the legendary Free League Publishing, everybody's favorite Swedish RPG publisher. The Blade Runner RPG was brought to life through a Kickstarter campaign, as Free League does with many of their projects. The game currently, at this point of recording, April 2023, currently consists of a starter set and a core rulebook. There's also a collector's edition of the core rulebook as well, but other than your typical cool cover, stuff like that, it is the same information, the same book inside. Similar to Alien, and you'll hear me similarize or compare this a lot to Alien, since that's another game I've played heavily from Free League, and like many of their games, shares a lot of DNA. But similar to Alien, the starter set has a slimmed down version of the core rules, containing just the rules that you need to play the game. It also includes a map of LA, custom dice, cards, and the first published adventure, which in this game are referred to as case files, which is called Electric Dreams. This scenario includes 4 pre-generated characters, a scenario book that details the adventure, several location maps, and plenty of physical props like crime scene photos and mugshots and files for various NPCs the players will encounter. The main core rulebook is a 240-page tome that includes all of the rules for playing the game, along with character creation, gear, tons of lore detailing things like locations throughout LA, the class system of rich and poor, and what life is like in the Blade Runner universe. And it's all beautifully illustrated by lead artist Martin Grip, the same chap who did the art for Alien. So if you like that kind of splattered, drippy, fuzzy art that he does, which I certainly do, he really helps bring Blade Runner to life. So, as with any RPG, we're going to start and talk a little bit about character creation. So it's fairly straightforward in this game, and one of the things that I really dig is that you can randomly determine just about everything with a few rolls of the dice. Kind of like in Warhammer Fantasy, you can let the dice kind of guide your character creation. Players in this game will each play as a Blade Runner working for the LAPD, and you can be either a human or a replicant, with replicants having some similar bonuses to those of androids and Alien. I'll try to point that out as we go through here today. You can even have the GM secretly roll to see if your PC is a hidden replicant. You know, they don't even know that they are one. Characters also have a class, referred to as an archetype, and similar to Alien, each archetype also has key attributes and skills, which means that those will be starting at a higher level. You have to level them up to a certain point at least. But it's very possible to have overlap between players since there's only 4 archetypes and only a dozen skills. If you want to make sure that your group has all their bases covered, if that's the type of group you like to play where everybody has their part to play, then I think it's worth a discussion when the players begin to create their PCs and choose their skills. The City Speaker and Skimmer archetypes are only available to human characters, while the Doxy archetype is only available to replicants. Players will also determine their years on the force, which will dictate some of their starting abilities. The longer you've been on the force, the more experienced of an officer you are, and this is reflected with increased skill points, specialties, which are like the talents of this game, promotion points, type of experience that you get in this game, and Chinyen, which is the currency in Blade Runner. However, the longer your character's been on the force, the less bonus points you have to distribute to your attribute scores. Kind of the idea that as you get older, you're not as physically or maybe mentally capable as you were when you were younger, but you've got life experience and your skills to make up for that. Replicants get a bonus here to either their strength or agility, a 1-point bonus, they can choose which, but they get reduced promotion and Chinyen points, and it is possible for them to start with 0. Now, since the lore in the book dictates that the new Blade Runner replicants are the new Nexus 9 model, The Nexus 9s have only been brought to market within the last year of the game, so a replicant PC must always be a rookie. They can't have been on the Force for any longer. And it's worth noting that the RPG takes place in 2037. The new Nexus 9 models were released in 2036, so this is after the original film, but a little bit before the second film. Now, once all this is determined, players will have extra points to spend to increase their starting attributes and skills, which again is based on how long you've been on the Force for. Now, like most of Free League's Year Zero engine games, there are 4 attributes: strength, agility, empathy, and intelligence, and 12 skills, 3 linked to each of the attributes. And if you've played any of the Free League games, especially Alien, you'll see a lot of similarity here. There's also a 13th skill, which is the driving skill, but that's based off the maneuverability of the vehicle you're driving rather than one of your skills. So you can still level that up and increase that, but rather than having it based off something like agility, it's based off the maneuverability score of the vehicle you're attempting to drive. Characters also have health and resolve, which are the limits to the amount of physical and mental damage you can sustain before you're broken. Health being your physical damage, and resolve being your mental or your stress damage. Replicants here, they get +2 health, again to represent that they're pretty hardy, but they get -2 resolve to represent that they have trouble dealing with their emotions, generating memories, things like that. Again, playing into the whole theme of Blade Runner. If a PC has been on the Force for longer than rookie status, there's 4 levels of how long you've been on the Force for. So if you're anything other than a rookie, you'll get to choose 1 or more specialties. And these are like the talents, almost identical to Alien. And the thing here is, while the game gives you suggestions for which ones you should choose based on your archetype, players are free to pick whichever ones they like. So there's really no limits here. There's really no prerequisites or anything like that. Some of them are pretty straightforward. You get a buff to like your health or your resolve. Others let you, work longer, things like that. So just cool things that, you'd be familiar with. Now, the next major point of character creation in this game is your key memory and key relationship. These are central to the theme and ideas of Blade Runner. So the relationship represents an important person in your life, while the memory, whether it's real or not, is a defining moment of your character's past. These can be completely rolled for randomly or chosen by the player. But the book, and I have to say I myself recommend randomly rolling. There's enough tables here that you roll on that generate some really interesting snippets for your players to think about. And I know for my players, we did everything randomly, and then they spent some time to think about that. And when we got ready for session 1, they had generated some cool little backstories with those. So, and it's kind of fun trying to piece some of those together, because you might have some weird ones. Our buddy Sean, he got his first relationship. He got a violent relationship. That was kind of the nature of it. But the actual companion was a DG, which is like a digital companion. So he kind of had to think, well, how do I make that work? So there's some cool things there. I really recommend you do it randomly. And finally, with character creation, as with most games, you'll get your starting gear, your starting Chinyan points, your money, a signature item, and promotion points. The starting gear is pretty much the same for everybody, as it all comes from the LAPD, so there's no difference as to which archetype you are. You're an officer. Here's your starting gear, which is your badge, your Kia unit, your blaster. You get a choice of one of the 2 starting pistols, and then you get access to a police spinner, which is one of the flying cars. What else? Oh, Chinyan. That's the currency of Blade Runner. It's used to acquire new gear, or, to grease palms during your investigation, bribe people, get some extra help. It's done, kind of a nebulous, 1 Chinyan point, 2 Chinyan points, and that just represents a certain amount of money. So we don't really count individual dollars or coins here. It's much less specific. Speaking of much less specific, before I forget, you don't track ammo in this game. Even unlike an Alien, which takes a very offhands approach to it, you don't even bother with that. It's just assumed you have enough ammo. So probably something you want to leave up to the GM to decide if you've run out of bullets in a stressful situation or something extreme. But other than that, you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to buy it. You don't have to collect it. Nothing like that. Also in this game, we've got signature items, and they work pretty much identical to those in Alien. Once per session, you can interact with your signature item, and you restore 1 resolve point or 1 point of stress. And then we have promotion points, and these can be spent to learn new specialties, learn new talents. I think it's 5 promotion points to learn a new talent. You can also use promotion points to request specialized gear from the LAPD. So if you want to get access to like an assault rifle, sniper rifle, or get access to certain department resources or facilities. So if you want to call in a SWAT team or put out an APB on, well, I guess that one's free, but there's different things you can do in the game. And there's actually a list of them. And what I've noticed so far in a lot of the actual plays I've listened to, I haven't really seen anybody use this, and I think it's meant to be used. So I think as a GM, you're meant to be giving your players promotion points at the end of each session, a couple of them probably, and they have to spend promotion points to get access to certain things. So I'm looking at the GM screen here. If you want to get an arrest warrant, that costs 1 promotion point. And then most of these you have to make some sort of skill roll, in this case connections, and if you pass, then your request goes through. And I think what they're trying to emulate here is that there's a lot of bureaucracy within the LAPD, and you've got to navigate that through your connections and through your standing, which I think is a good way to think of promotion points. So it's a currency that they have, and it's meant to be used, and it can also buff your character a little bit too. And then you can actually spend promotion points to get extra Chinyan points as well, which represents you getting a small raise. I think it can only be done 1 per case file, but you can spend 1 promotion point and then potentially get a 1 Chinyan point added to your account, so to speak. So that's a little bit of character creation. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. But now let's talk about the rules. And the basic rules here all revolve around the dice pools. So unlike most of Free League's Year Zero games, Blade Runner does not use the D6 dice pool mechanic and instead uses a stepped dice mechanic. So all of your attributes and skills will range from level A down to level D, and this determines which size of multi-sided dice you're going to roll. Level A rolls a D12, B rolls a D10, C rolls a D8, and D rolls a D6. So typically, whenever you make a roll, you're going to roll 2 dice, 1 for your attribute and 1 for your skills. So if your agility was A and your firearms skill was a C, you'd roll a D12 and a D8 when you made a firearms roll. Any dice that comes up with a 6 or a higher is a success. So obviously rolling larger dice means you have more of a chance to get a success. And if you roll a 10 or higher on the D10 or D12, those count as 2 successes. And these are indicated on the custom dice with the image of an eye, which if you've seen the Blade Runner movies, you are familiar with the whole idea of an eye image. Now, normally you only need 1 success to pass a test, but occasionally the GM might rule that you need more than 1, or in the case of a pose test, it's whoever rolls the most successes wins. And with pretty much all the rolls in the game, if you roll 2 or more successes past what you needed to pass the test, you score a critical success. So not only do you pass the test, but you'll gain some sort of additional benefit. Now, the game has a list of suggestions, and if you've played Alien, it's kind of like stunts. You could act more quickly or quietly, maybe get additional information to what you're doing. But the players are encouraged to ask the GM or come up with their own if they have a cool idea. In combat, this is how you deal critical injuries. Just like with pretty much all of Free League's games, Blade Runner has a pushing mechanic. and a skill roll can be pushed if a player wishes to try to get more successes. When you push, you simply re-roll any of the dice that you just rolled as long as they didn't come up as a 1. And in this game, on the custom dice, the 1 is a little origami unicorn. However, if you roll any 1s on your re-roll, or if any of the dice you previously rolled were a 1, you suffer damage. You lose a point of health if you were making a strength or agility-based test, and you lose a point of resolve if you were making an empathy or an intelligence-based test. I can't remember if it's 1-to-1. I can't remember, so if you roll 2 1s, you lose 2 points. I don't recall off the top of my head, but so there's a risk there if you re-roll. Now, replicants, they can push twice, but they only ever suffer resolve damage, even if they're making an agility or strength roll. So they are usually at more of a danger of freaking out, and because they start with less resolve points, there's a fine balancing act there for players to consider. Now, something different here from Alien is that this game has an advantage and disadvantage system, and it's pretty basic, pretty straightforward, but it works. When you have advantage, you get to roll an extra dice of the same type as your lowest dice. So in our previous example, we had a d12 and a d8. If we had advantage, we'd roll 1 d12 and 2 d8, and you get to add all those up together, not just the highest ones. And if you have disadvantage, you remove your lowest dice, meaning you're going to be only rolling 1 die, so making the test much more harder. Advantage and disadvantage cancel each other out on a 1-to-1 basis, so if you have 2 advantage and 2 disadvantage, there's nothing. If you got 3 advantage and 2 disadvantage, you've got 1 more advantage, so you get advantage. You either have it or you don't, basically. We've got group rolls here, just like in most games. They make it pretty straightforward. If there's a situation that comes up where everyone in the group wants to make a roll, the players simply choose the best amongst them to make that roll on the group's behalf. And of course, if they pass, everybody passes. If they fail, then everybody's failed. Players can assist when they're doing that, but generally speaking, one person makes the roll. The only exception to this that I've seen or that I can recall is stealth. In the case of a group stealth roll, the player with the lowest skill level makes the roll for the entire group. And then we have helping or assisting. If someone wants to assist you on a roll, you gain advantage, but instead of doubling your lowest dice, you roll an extra dice equal to the skill rating of the person assisting you. So again, in our example, we had a d12 and a d8. Instead of rolling a d12 and 2 d8, let's say the person helping us has a skill rating of B, so they'd have a d10. We'd be rolling a d12 and a d8 for our attribute and skill, and then a d10 for their skill rating as they are helping us, and that's all because of advantage. So that's the basic dice mechanic. It's a little different, obviously, because we're using multi-sided dice, but it avoids having large dice pools, which, I think there's ups and downs for both of those, but overall, it seems to work. Now, combat, of course, with any RPG is a pretty important thing. We need to know how it resolves, and you'll see some shared DNA here from Alien. So first off, initiative is done with a deck of cards, 1 through 10, 1 being the first person to act in the round. Range is calculated using the categories, just like in Alien, engage, short, medium, long, and extreme. And if you're using the official maps, these are marked by zones, and each zone counts as 1 range band. Blade Runner keeps the action economy even more simple than Alien by simply giving you a single move and a single action during your turn. Your move allows you to move a single zone, stand up from prone, go prone, take cover. You can also do things like sprint and crawl, but these also take up your action for the round. There's a list of 12 actions that you can use during your turn, and you'll see a familiar actions and things like making an attack, using an item, or taking aim with a ranged weapon. And honestly, most of the actions here are variations of making an attack. So whether it's a grapple, breaking out of a grapple, shooting, taking aim, throwing a weapon, melee attack, unarmed attack, that's like half of them right there. So It's not too complicated, and you don't have to worry about slow, fast action. It's just one action, one move. Now, melee attacks, as you would probably guess, are resolved as opposed hand-to-hand combat rolls. However, the caveat here is that whoever wins causes damage, not just the attacker. So melee can be a bit of a gamble unless you're really built for it. It makes combat pretty brutal, but also nice and quick. If you win the roll, you inflict damage equal to the damage value of the weapon, and +1 for each extra success you have in excess of your opponent's roll. So let's say you're using a damage 2 weapon, you roll 3 successes, your opponent rolls 2, you win the fight, you do 2 damage because of the weapon, plus an extra 1 because you've got an extra success there. Just kind of like stunts in Alien. Ranged attacks are resolved as an unopposed firearms roll. So you simply roll and you inflict damage based on the weapon you're using, +1 for each additional success you have. Now, in both cases, if you roll 2 or more successes on the roll, above what you need, if it's an opposed test, or just 2 or more on a range test, you also inflict a critical injury. You don't do critical injuries when somebody becomes broken, normally in this game. However, if you're broken, meaning you're at 0 health, then any damage you take becomes a critical. But you don't get an automatic critical when you hit 0. So again, 2 or more successes on the roll, you inflict critical injury. Most weapons in the game have a critical rating on their profile, which is the type of die that you'll roll when you inflict a critical injury. So it might say D10, meaning you roll a D10, and then you consult the critical injury table, which is based on the type of damage that you're dealing, either crushing or piercing damage. There's a scale of 1 to 12 here, variety of injuries that you can suffer, with the lower numbers generally being more forgiving and the higher numbers resulting in fatal injuries or instant death. Some of them will have a time frame you need to get medical attention before you die. Others kill you outright. And just about all of them will maim or hamper your character in some way until it's healed. Whether it's, a reduced efficiency to your skills, or you can't do certain actions, things like that. One last thing here is if you roll more than 2 successes, each success lets you roll an additional critical die, and you get to pick the result. So if you roll enough successes on an attack, you can potentially roll multiple critical rolls and then pick which one you want. So you don't have to necessarily pick the higher one if you're not trying to kill somebody or really maim them, but the option is there. Now, Blade Runner also has a stress system, which you'll be familiar with if you played other Free League games. In this, you can suffer stress either by rolling a 1 when you push an intelligence or empathy roll, or the GM can determine that you've encountered a stressful situation, kind of like an Alien. In this case, the GM will tell you how much stress the event has caused, usually between 1 to 3, and then you make an insight roll, and you reduce the incoming damage for each success that you get. So you don't instantly get stress like an Alien. In this, you actually have a chance to resist it based on your character's insight ability. If you reach 0 resolve, you are broken by stress and you suffer a critical stress effect. Now, these are only a D6 table, but there's a different table for humans, and then there's a separate one for replicants. And these tables represent the mental strain of the investigation taking its toll, and include results like breaking down, attacking somebody nearby, or just saying fuck it and calling it a day and going home in the middle of investigation. Damage to both your health and resolve can be healed in a variety of ways, such as medical aid, resting, certain drugs, or even talking to a friendly face. It is possible that after being broken by stress, you could permanently lose a point of resolve, so you must roll the base dice of your empathy score every time that you've been broken by stress, and if you roll a 1, your resolve score is permanently reduced by 1. If your resolve ever reaches 0 in this way, that critical effect that you had, the critical stress effect that you got, becomes permanent, and you have to retire your your Blade Runner. Kind of like when your character goes insane in a game like Call of Cthulhu, or in Warhammer when you get too many mutations. Now, one of my favorite features in this game is that, just like in the second film, replicant players may be called upon to take a baseline test, and if they fail 3 of these in a row, they are immediately retired. Now, generally, you only have to take a baseline test if you're broken by stress and your superiors learn of it, and as long as you don't fail 3 consecutive tests, you'll be okay. But it really adds some flavor of the Blade Runner universe, and it's another mechanic that really helps make this feel like you're playing Blade Runner. And it's been some of our favorite parts to roleplay, and if you listen to a lot of different actual plays, it's really fun to hear players' takes on this when they actually roleplay it out. So check out that scene in the second movie. I think there's 2 of them, and it's a cool thing in the game. Finally, we've got, well, that's really everything for combat, I guess. That's everything for combat. But we've got a couple other features in the game here I want to talk about really quick. First is basic investigations, and this has a bit to do with how time works in the game. So this game breaks time into 4 shifts. Each day has 4 shifts: morning, day, evening, and night. And the typical gameplay of the game revolves around the players telling the GM what they're doing during each shift. This usually is investigating a single lead or location, but it might include other things. But generally, the way the game works, at least with the starter scenario and how they explain things in the rules, is each shift, represents about, 4 to 8 hours, 4 to 6 hours, something like that. And taking into account travel time and investigations, going through the red tape of bureaucracy, things like that, you can explore or check out one location for each shift. And it's important because the case files will have basically a countdown the GM is keeping track of. So things in the story keep happening and keep moving regardless of what the players are doing. So they might miss a chance to stop something from happening if they act too slow, and the story's going to progress even if their investigation is not, which that might progress their investigation, but not in the way they were hoping. So it's important to keep track of that. Now, during investigations, one of the things that the starter set has are these crime scene photos. And the idea is that the GM shows the players that are investigating this area the crime scene photo, and they have to actually look through it and ask the GM questions about what they're seeing. So they might say, well, what's going on with this book on the table, or is there anything in that desk drawer that I see in this picture? I think it's a cool feature. It's a neat idea. It definitely makes you feel like you're an investigator. You're having to pay attention to little minute details in the photo. I've seen people perhaps argue the fact, or the point that if you're making your own case files, you need this sort of thing. And if you're not a good artist, or you don't have access to somebody who is a good artist, this could maybe make the game less interesting or feel less cool. I can see why they would say that, but honestly, we're all, role players here. We're all GMs, and it's not necessary. It certainly adds to the feel of Blade Runner. At least I don't think it's necessary. I could see myself running a case file without that sort of stuff. But it's an interesting way to have players look at the scene instead of just, I make an observation test, what do I find? Now, you can still do that, especially if players are stumped or you don't have the photo. But the photo is an interesting way, and it's a cool little quirk here. But I don't think it's necessary. I don't think your game's going to suffer if you don't have them or have access to them, or if yours aren't as beautiful as the official ones. But something to consider. I think it's a fair point. Now, along with this whole shift mechanic of time, we also have downtime. So your PCs can't work indefinitely. Whether they're replicant or human, they do eventually need to rest. And the way this works in the game is if you work more than 3 shifts in a row without resting, you suffer a point of stress as fatigue and mental burnout begins to catch up with you. Now, instead, instead of investigating during a shift, a player can take some downtime. This means they rest, recuperate, and the players are encouraged to describe exactly what their PC does during this time. The GM will also roll a random event that happens either in the PC's home or out on the streets based on what they're doing. And these can have various in-game effects and create interesting twists in the story that break off from the main case or dive further into a specific character's personal life. These might let you recover extra stress, or mean your stress and health don't recover as quickly, or maybe you got to get a favor for a friend, or make some sort of roll to avoid some sort of bad outcome. So another cool thing here that tries to play into the idea that you're a detective working the case, but eventually you've got to slow down. So normally, there's a couple talents and things that change this, but normally after 3 shifts, you got to take a break, or perhaps suffer. Another feature that's kind of unique to Blade Runner, at least the way they handle it, is the chase mechanic. So a lot of RPGs have chase mechanics with how you pursue somebody who's fleeing. In this game, a chase generally triggers if somebody moves off of a combat map, or if the GM decides, okay, we're in a chase now. And this acts like a little bit like a little mini game where the players involved, referred to as the pursuer and the prey. The pursuer obviously being the person chasing, the prey being the person fleeing. Each of them secretly chooses one of 6 different maneuvers. The GM then randomly, he determines the distance between the 2 groups, the starting distance, how far away they are, and then randomly generates an obstacle that pops up each round during the chase. Everybody then reveals their chosen maneuver and carries these out, starting with the person who's fleeing, the prey. Now, most of these will require some sort of roll to accomplish, and they affect the chase in a variety of ways. Might let you catch up to your opponent, cut them off, you can try to hide during the chase, or even open fire with a ranged weapon and probably start a combat. The obstacles that the GM generates will throw a variety of variable effects into the chase, such as a dead end, or street thugs that attack you, or traffic up ahead that blocks your path or slows you down. And these will affect how the maneuvers are performed, or if they're allowed at all, or maybe make modifiers to those maneuvers. It's a pretty simple mechanic, but it's really fun, it's very flavorful, and I think it fits perfectly into Blade Runner. And it can kind of become its own little scene or own little story, and it's like a combat that isn't necessarily as complex and can be, kind of cool. So again, if you're trying to get in that mentality of being a detective on the case, I think this is a mechanic that really strengthens and encourages that. And there's also separate obstacle tables for the GM if you're doing a ground foot chase, a ground vehicle chase, or an aerial vehicle chase. So I haven't done any vehicle chases yet, but some pretty cool stuff there. Last bit about rules and mechanics are humanity points. We already talked a little about promotion points, so they kind of fall into this too. So promotion points and humanity points are kind of like the experience points in this game. Promotion points you use, as I said, to request gear, special gear you don't normally have access to, or use LAPD resources, or learn new specialties. Humanity points are used to increase your skill ratings. The higher the skill rating, the more experience or humanity points it takes. Now, both of these, very similar to experience points in Alien, are meant to be handed out at the end of the session. There's a list of things you go through, and if the player or the group did these things, they might get a promotion point or a humanity point. Generally, promotion points are earned when you do stuff that you would be doing to kind of further your job and further your case as a Blade Runner. So, capturing suspects, retiring a replicant, handing in evidence, things like that. Whereas humanity points are more kind of gained when your character does the right thing or the empathetic thing. So maybe you let a suspect go that is innocent, or you made a tough choice and you made the more humane one. or if a replicant fails a baseline test, they actually get a humanity point. So important to do those at the end of the session. Again, it helps kind of reinforce that theme here in Blade Runner of the moral gray. Not everything's black and white, and the story is about the choices and decisions that the characters have to make along the way. Now, if you can't tell already, I'm a big fan of Blade Runner and this game. I've only recently really discovered Blade Runner over the last couple years and seriously gotten into it, but I'm really digging it so far. And just like Alien, I think this game has really hit the nail on the head. I think the RPG allows players to experience something quite different than the usual dungeon delve or hack and slash that a lot of other mainstream RPGs offer. I really like the mechanics, and I think Free League has done an excellent job once again adapting this to their Year Zero engine. I wasn't sure how I felt about the stepped dice at first, but now after having played a few sessions, I can say I really enjoy it. I don't know if I prefer this over the D6 dice pool or prefer one over the other. I think they both run fairly smoothly and they each have their place at the table. And really, I think in the end, it's probably just a matter of personal preference. Do you want to roll a lot of dice or just a couple weird shaped dice, I think Free League's really nailed and captured the finer points of the Blade Runner universe, and I think things like the chase mechanics, the key memory and relationships, and the baseline tests all help fuel that immersion even a bit more. My one big complaint about the game would have to be the archetypes, though. Even more so than in Alien, I do not think they feel distinct enough from one another. Other than some flavor text, the only real difference is the suggested specialties, and the book even goes so far as to say that the players are free to choose whichever ones they want, and not just those that are suggested. So personally, I feel like if you're going to go to the trouble to name and design a whole class system, it should have some more weight to it. It should affect the game more in some way. I don't know if Blade Runner necessarily even needs a class system, since everybody's playing a Blade Runner, everybody's playing a detective. But I tend to like having class systems in my RPGs. I think they help everyone at the table have a better idea as to what each player is capable of, and can help inform a player when they're creating their character, what kind of character they're making, or help steer them in the direction if they have an idea of the type of character they want to make. I mean, you could really completely remove the archetypes from this game, and it would have literally no mechanical bearing in any way other than what your key attributes and key skills have to be. So in that sense, it seems weird to me to have it here in the first place. One last thing I want to touch on is something that I've seen talked about in the wilds of the internet is why would someone even want to play this game? Especially if you're not familiar with the system or the universe, you're not into it. Essentially this argument boils down to replicants are essentially slaves in the Blade Runner universe, and Blade Runners are meant to usually hunt them down and kill them. And to most people at first glance, this seems like a terrible premise for a game, and I would agree with that. However, as anyone who has seen the films know, Blade Runner is about the moral gray area between the black and white. It's about the choices people have to make when they're confronted with terrible dilemmas. It's the classic trope of following orders for the sake of following orders, or do you start to grow some morality and humanity at the expense of what you're supposedly supposed to do? The game doesn't encourage you to mindlessly execute replicants. Instead, it challenges the players to face these decisions head on and try to make the best of an awful situation. And as a matter of fact, in some cases, you're rewarded for not being a mindless executioner. You get humanity points, which in the end of the day are a type of experience point here. So there is an actual benefit to not being a total asshole. If you want to try to change the world and save every replicant, the game gives you the freedom to do that. And from what I've seen so far from my own players and other shows that I've listened to and watch, most players seem to fall on that side of the coin. I think most players, they're in touch with their usual humanity, and they're not out to just randomly execute people and cause terrible, terrible things. But in the end, the choice is up to you as to whether or not you think this would be a good fit for your gaming table and your group. I personally love it, and I think the stories that it can help create could be really interesting, and I would encourage you to at least give it a try before you pass on it. If nothing else, try out the starter set adventure and see what you and your group think. Maybe have a talk with your group and see if it's something you guys even want to do in the first place. So, if you're a fan of investigative games like Call of Cthulhu or Vaesen, if you're looking for a game that forces you to confront moral dilemmas, question your humanity, then I recommend giving Blade Runner a try. If you like the cyberpunk genre, or if you're a fan of this incredible universe in any way, I think this game does a great job of letting you step into the shoes of a Blade Runner and getting to explore the sights and sounds of 2037 Los Angeles. If you're new to RPGs, even though this is a bit of a niche game, I think it's easy enough to learn and wrap your head around that it's worth trying out. So, I hope you found this little introduction to the Blade Runner franchise and the RPG useful, helpful. If you're interested in hearing more, be sure to check out our Session 0, where my players create their own Blade Runners, and then join us next time for Episode 1 as we dive into the starter set adventure Electric Dreams with our own custom Blade Runners. See you guys all on the flip side. Nighty night.